Amara could feel the shopkeeper's eyes on her before she even touched the door. The boutique was bathed in soft lighting and expensive silence, but the weight of suspicion clung to her like a shadow. She had been saving for this moment for months, yet somehow it felt like she had walked into a battlefield. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Amara stood on the sidewalk just outside the boutique, taking a deep breath. The sun, casting its warm afternoon glow over the city, kissed her brown skin, and she let the heat sink into her, as if trying to gather strength from it. Her reflection stared back at her from the boutique's glass window. A girl of 16, wearing a simple denim jacket over a floral dress, her box braids neatly pulled back into a high ponytail. Her large, almond-shaped eyes sparkled with determination, though there was a flicker of hesitation just beneath the surface. This store was not her usual kind of place. Nestled in the heart of the city's most expensive district, the boutique practically screamed luxury. She could see it from the way the mannequins in the window were dressed. Elegant gowns that looked like they belonged at a gala, shoes that sparkled under the soft spotlights, and purses that cost more than her mom's rent. Amara had never set foot inside a store like this before. The kind of place where you don't check the price tags because if you have to, you can't afford it. But today was different. Today, she was here on a mission. Clutching her small wallet tightly in her hand, she thought about the countless hours she'd spent saving up for this. After school shifts at the local library, babysitting on weekends, even doing odd jobs around her neighborhood. Cleaning Mrs. Johnson's yard, running errands for Mr. Peters down the block. It had all led to this moment. Her mom's 40th birthday was just days away, and she wanted to do something special. Her mom deserved it. She deserved more than the typical birthday card and bouquet from the grocery store, and Amara was determined to make sure her gift matched the kind of love her mom had always given her. Pushing the door open, Amara stepped inside, and immediately the world outside seemed to melt away. The hum of the city disappeared, replaced by the soft tinkling of music playing through hidden speakers. The interior of the boutique was like stepping into another dimension, polished, pristine, and calm. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and roses, and the lighting was soft, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. Her eyes widened as she took in the space. Shelves made of glass and sleek white wood displayed luxurious items, handbags with intricate stitching, gleaming jewelry nestled on velvet cushions, and scarves so delicate they seemed to float in the air. Everything was arranged to perfection, like a curated museum exhibit, where each item had its place, carefully placed under soft spotlights, inviting admiration and awe. There were only a few customers inside, mostly well-dressed women who looked like they shopped here often. One of them, in a tailored navy suit and heels that clicked against the marble floor, was chatting with an assistant, laughing lightly at something he said as he pulled down a scarf that looked like it was spun from silk and stars. Amara felt a momentary pang of self-consciousness. She wasn't like these women, who moved around the store like they belonged here, their movements casual, confident. They seemed to glide effortlessly from display to display, their manicured fingers grazing over the products as if selecting which gem to add to their collection. Still, Amara squared her shoulders and reminded herself why she was here. This was about her mom, her mother who had worked herself to the bone, making sacrifices, working long hours at the hospital just to provide for Amara. Her mother, who never bought anything nice for herself because she was too busy making sure her daughter had everything she needed. No, Amara wasn't about to let some fancy store make her feel out of place. Not today. As she made her way deeper into the store, her heart raced with excitement. She wanted to find something perfect, something that would light up her mom's face when she opened it. Maybe a handbag that could elevate her mom's everyday outfits, or a necklace that would make her shine. Amara was drawn to a glass display near the center of the store where a collection of rings sat. She leaned in closer, admiring the way the gems caught the light, creating tiny rainbows on the glass. "This is it," she whispered to herself, and for sure feeling the flutter of nerves mix with the thrill of being so close to her goal. Just as she was about to step closer to another display, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then she felt it again. The feeling of being watched. She glanced around, her gaze catching on a middle-aged man standing behind the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the store. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, his dark hair slicked back in a style that suggested he took his job very seriously. His eyes, however, weren't on the other customers. They were on her. Amara blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face, but she shrugged it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. After all, it was his job to keep an eye on the store, right? But as she moved from one display to the next, she couldn't shake the sensation. Every time she shifted her position, the man's eyes seemed to follow her. It wasn't just casual observation. There was something more pointed about it, almost as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake. Amara's excitement began to dip slightly as the unease settled in. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the beautiful items in front of her, but the man's gaze was impossible to dismiss. He wasn't watching the other women in the store like that. No, they moved around freely, unbothered and unnoticed. But her? She was being tracked. She forced a smile as she moved toward another section of the store. Her hands hovered over a display of necklaces, but she suddenly felt awkward even touching them. The shopkeeper's eyes burned into her back, and now the joy she had felt just moments before began to fade. Why was he watching her like that? Amara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just here to shop like everyone else. But somehow, her presence was suspicious. She could feel the weight of the shopkeeper's assumptions pressing down on her, thickening the air around her. But she wasn't going to let it get to her. Not yet. Not before she found the perfect gift for her mom. Not before she proved him wrong. Amara tried to shake off the strange feeling, but it clung to her like a stubborn shadow. The shopkeeper's eyes followed her, lingering a little too long, and she couldn't help but notice the sharpness in his gaze. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. An unspoken suspicion, a silent judgment hanging in the air. She could feel it in the way he stood, arms crossed, just a few steps behind her, pretending to organize a display. Her heart beat a little faster. Why was he watching her like that? Amara let her fingers glide over a display of silk scarves, feigning interest, trying to appear nonchalant, but her thoughts were racing. Was he following her because he thought she didn't belong here? She looked down at herself, her simple dress, her worn sneakers. Maybe she didn't fit the profile of the store's usual customers, but that didn't mean she deserved to be treated like she was up to something. Her mind flicked back to the stories she'd overheard at school, tales from her classmates who had dealt with similar treatment. Microaggressions, they called it. The silent assumptions, the way people's eyes followed you in certain places, not because of what you were doing, but because of who they thought you were. A black girl in an expensive boutique. Yeah, maybe that was enough for some people to make their conclusions. Her chest tightened and she felt a swell of frustration rising within her. But she pushed it down. She was here for a reason, and no one, not even this judgmental shopkeeper, was going to take this moment from her. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of feeling justified in his behavior. As she walked toward a display of elegant handbags, her ears caught the soft clink of the shopkeeper's shoes against the floor. She glanced over her shoulder, just in time to see him pretending to adjust the position of a bag. He wasn't even subtle anymore. He was tailing her, making no effort to hide it. Amara's brow furrowed. A woman with sleek blonde hair breezed by, her perfume wafting in the air as she passed. The shopkeeper didn't even look her way. Instead, his attention remained locked on Amara, as if her every move was a potential threat. She gripped the strap of her purse a little tighter and took a deep breath. This was ridiculous. She was here to spend her hard-earned money, just like anyone else. And yet, the more she moved around the store, the more she felt like a thief who hadn't even committed a crime. "Is there something I can help you with?" The voice was smooth but carried an edge to it, like someone trying to sound polite but failing to hide the condescension underneath. Amara looked up and saw the shopkeeper standing just a few feet away now, his expression neutral, but his eyes flickering with something else. His hands were clasped in front of him, his posture straight, but the way he was watching her made it clear he was suspicious. "No, I'm fine," Amara replied, her voice steady but cool. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of thinking he had rattled her. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her response. "Let me know if you need assistance," he added, lingering just a beat too long before turning and walking back to the counter. Amara exhaled slowly, trying to push away the tension that had taken hold of her muscles. She could feel the stares now, not just from the shopkeeper, but from the other customers as well. Or at least, it felt like they were watching. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as the soft, ambient music that had once felt calming now grated against her ears. She moved to the back of the store, hoping for some space, but the unease followed her. She could hear the faint shuffle of the shopkeeper's footsteps again, his presence close enough to remind her he wasn't done scrutinizing her. It was almost comical. He had nothing else to do in the whole store but watch her? A new surge of anger flared up inside her. Why should she feel like this? Why should she feel like an intruder, like she had to justify her very existence in this place? She was a paying customer, yet here she was, being treated like a walking security threat. As she stopped in front of a jewelry display, she caught her own reflection in the glass case. Her dark brown eyes stared back at her, full of frustration and disbelief. She wasn't going to steal anything, but the shopkeeper had already decided who she was. He had made his judgment without knowing a single thing about her. She could feel the weight of it. He wasn't just looking at her as a customer, he was seeing her through the filter of his own biases. Amara clenched her jaw. Part of her wanted to just walk out, to leave this place and never look back. But another part of her, a bigger part, was determined to stand her ground. She had saved up for this. She wasn't going to let some narrow-minded shopkeeper take away the moment she had worked so hard for. She stepped away from the jewelry display, her eyes scanning the store until she found what she was looking for, the section with the high-end items. The items they usually keep behind glass, the ones with price tags so high they didn't even bother displaying them up front. If the shopkeeper thought she was a problem, she was going to show him exactly how wrong he was. With purpose in her step, Amara made her way over to the display case where the most expensive items in the store were laid out like treasures in a museum. Behind the thick glass, she saw a stunning gold necklace studded with tiny diamonds that shimmered under the spotlight. It was the kind of piece that would make anyone feel like royalty. Perfect. She stood there for a moment, letting the shopkeeper see exactly where she was. She felt his eyes on her, and she could almost sense the tension as he realized she wasn't just browsing anymore. She was making a serious move. "Excuse me," Amara said, her voice steady but filled with quiet confidence. She turned to one of the assistants nearby, a young woman who had been folding scarves. The assistant glanced at her, her expression momentarily surprised, but she quickly masked it with a professional smile. "Yes, how can I assist you?" the assistant asked, stepping toward her with cautious politeness. "I'd like to see this piece, please," Amara said, pointing to the necklace inside the case. The assistant hesitated, her fingers hovering over the key to the glass cabinet. She glanced briefly toward the shopkeeper, as if waiting for some kind of signal, but when none came, she slowly unlocked the case and carefully lifted the necklace out. Amara could feel the shopkeeper's eyes burning into her from across the room. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was louder than any accusation. She wasn't just some girl browsing anymore. She was about to make a statement. The assistant placed the necklace carefully in front of Amara, her hands steady, but her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. The shimmering gold chain adorned with tiny diamonds gleamed under the soft store lights. It was breathtaking. A piece of art that looked almost too delicate to touch, like it belonged more in a museum than around someone's neck. Amara inhaled slowly, letting her fingers hover above the necklace, tracing the air around the intricate details. She could feel her heartbeat slow as she focused on the task at hand. This was it. This was the gift her mother deserved, a symbol of everything she had sacrificed, a token of gratitude for the countless nights her mom had worked late shifts at the hospital, coming home with aching feet and tired eyes, but always with a smile for her daughter. Amara was about to make it all worth it, but even as she tried to lose herself in the moment, that prickling sensation returned. The feeling of being watched, of being judged, grew more intense. She didn't even have to look up to know that the shopkeeper's gaze was glued to her, like he was waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to reveal herself as the person he had already decided she was. Amara's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. The tension she'd been pushing down for the past few minutes was bubbling to the surface, and this time it refused to be ignored. She could feel the eyes of the assistant on her too, their silence speaking louder than any words. The shopkeeper wasn't even hiding it anymore. He had positioned himself at the edge of the display area, leaning against a counter, arms crossed as if ready to pounce. Amara bit her lip, feeling the sting of the moment as it sank in. No matter what she did, no matter how carefully she moved, no matter how much she saved, no matter how hard she worked, people like him would always see her as a suspect first and a customer second. Her heart sank with the weight of the realization, and for a moment, the joy of this special occasion felt tainted. She knew what was going on. She'd felt it before in other places, though maybe not as obvious as this. The unspoken rules, the assumptions, the whispers of judgment that followed her around whenever she stepped into places like this. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about her. This was for her mother, and she wasn't about to let this man ruin her day. Amara straightened her back, lifting her chin just a little higher. She had worked too hard for this. She had sacrificed too much. Her mom had sacrificed too much, and she wasn't going to let the insecurities of some prejudiced shopkeeper take this moment away from her. She had just as much right to be here as anyone else. With newfound resolve, Amara turned to the assistant. "I'd like to see how it looks," she said, her voice clear and confident. She tilted her head slightly, her expression daring the assistant to challenge her. The assistant blinked, clearly taken aback by Amara's directness. "Of course," she murmured, quickly pulling a small velvet tray from beneath the counter. She laid the necklace out carefully, adjusting it so Amara could see it against the rich, dark fabric. "It's one of our finest pieces," she added, her tone professional but still guarded. Amara reached out and gently lifted the necklace. The cool metal was surprisingly heavy in her hands, the weight of it feeling almost symbolic. It was perfect. Her mom would love it. She could picture the smile on her mother's face, the way her eyes would light up with surprise and joy. As she admired the necklace, she felt the tension in the room grow thicker. She knew the shopkeeper was watching her every move, probably waiting for her to ask the price or hesitate in some way that would confirm his suspicions. But Amara didn't falter. She had saved enough. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking otherwise. She placed the necklace back down on the velvet tray and turned to the assistant with a polite smile. "I'll take it," she said firmly. For a moment, the assistant just stared at her, like she hadn't expected Amara to make such a decisive choice. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she reached for the necklace, carefully placing it back in its case. "Of course," she said, regaining her composure. "Let me get that wrapped for you." As the assistant disappeared behind the counter to retrieve the packaging, Amara glanced around the store. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere now, a sort of quiet disbelief from the other customers and even some of the staff. She could sense their surprise, their eyes flicking in her direction, though no one dared say a word. Amara's gaze flicked toward the shopkeeper. He was still standing by the counter, his expression tight as though he was trying to make sense of what was happening. For a brief second, their eyes met, and in that moment, Amara saw something flicker in his expression. Maybe it was the realization that his assumptions had been wrong. Maybe it was the realization that he had underestimated her. Amara didn't break eye contact. She stared back at him, unblinking, her expression calm but firm, letting him know that she wasn't going to be intimidated by him. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She was here because she belonged here, just like anyone else. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shopkeeper dropped his gaze. He turned away, busying himself with something on the counter. But the damage was done. He knew now. He had no right to judge her. The assistant returned with the necklace, now beautifully wrapped in a sleek, glossy box, tied with a satin ribbon. "Here you go, miss," she said, handing the package to Amara. Her tone was more respectful now, as if she had realized that this girl standing in front of her wasn't to be underestimated either. Amara smiled as she took the package. It felt heavier than she'd expected, but not in a bad way. The weight of it felt like a triumph, like a reminder of everything she had worked for. She walked toward the register, her footsteps deliberate and steady, the eyes of the other customers still following her as she made her way across the store. She could hear the faint hum of the cash register as the assistant rang up the sale. The final price appeared on the screen, but Amara didn't blink. She had already calculated everything. She handed over her card with a calmness that belied the storm of emotions swirling inside her. As the assistant processed the transaction, Amara glanced around the store one last time. The shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. Maybe he had disappeared to the back, unwilling to face the reality of his own assumptions. Or maybe he was still watching from somewhere, too ashamed to admit his mistake. Amara didn't care. She had won. The receipt printed with a soft whir, and the assistant handed it to her with a smile that was now genuine. "Thank you for your purchase," she said. "I hope your mother loves it." Amara smiled back. "She will," she replied, taking the box and tucking it under her arm. With her head held high, Amara walked out of the boutique, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face again. But this time, it felt different. It felt like victory. She hadn't just bought a gift today. She had taken a stand, for herself, for her mother, for every time someone had doubted her or made her feel small. And as she strode down the sidewalk, the weight of the box in her hands felt lighter, but its meaning heavier than ever. The chime of the cash register echoed through the boutique, cutting through the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle hum of background music. As the receipt printed out, Amara's heart beat steadily in her chest. There was no going back now. Not that she wanted to. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Months of saving, planning, and now she was finally here. The expensive gold necklace, the one that shimmered like a constellation, was hers. But the real moment wasn't the purchase itself. No, it was the way the store had grown eerily quiet. The soft, polite chattering from other customers had faded into a thick silence, and even the clink of jewelry being handled by assistants seemed to pause. It was like the entire store was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Amara could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Their silent shock rippled through the air, more potent than any words could be. It was as if they had all collectively realized the same thing. She wasn't here to window shop. She wasn't here to be tolerated. She was here to make a statement. And she had done just that. The assistant behind the counter handed Amara the receipt, her hands shaking slightly, though she tried to maintain her composure. "Thank you so much for your purchase, miss," she said, her voice polite, but with a newfound respect that wasn't there before. She was no longer looking at Amara like she might break something, but as a customer, one whose purchase far outweighed most in the store that day. Amara smiled, taking the receipt and carefully placing it in her wallet. "You're welcome," she said, her tone light and easy, as if the tension that had filled the store wasn't pressing in on her from all sides. The assistant continued. "Would you like this wrapped for a gift?" she asked, glancing at the exquisite box that held the necklace. "Yes, please," Amara replied, glancing around as the assistant turned away to begin the process. She could see the subtle shifts in the room. The woman in the tailored navy suit, who had been gliding through the store so confidently earlier, was now frozen near a display of handbags, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the counter as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Her eyes flitted to Amara's face, then down to the gleaming jewelry box, then back up again. She looked almost, dare Amara think it, impressed. Other customers were more discreet in their gawking, but it didn't take much for Amara to feel the sudden shift in the air. The boutique staff, the well-dressed clientele, even the security guard near the entrance who had been casually eyeing the floor before, were all hyper-focused on this unexpected moment. No one had expected the young black girl in the denim jacket and sneakers to buy the most expensive piece of jewelry in the store that day. And yet, here she was. Amara's eyes finally landed on the shopkeeper. He stood behind the main counter, pretending to review inventory sheets, but she knew better. His stiff posture, his fidgeting hands, the slight flush on his cheeks. He was rattled. She could practically feel the confusion and embarrassment radiating off him. He had been wrong, and he knew it. He must have assumed she couldn't afford anything in his precious boutique. He had judged her the moment she walked in, following her around like a hawk watching a rabbit. And now, as she completed her purchase, it was clear that the only one who had been out of place here was him. The assistant returned with the gift-wrapped box, handing it to Amara with a professional but slightly warmer smile than before. "Here you go," she said. "I hope your mother enjoys it." "She will," Amara replied, holding the box gently in her hands. It was beautifully wrapped in gold paper, tied with a silver ribbon, a perfect match for the necklace inside. A symbol of everything her mother had given her. A token of love, hard work, and now a small victory. Just as she turned to leave, the shopkeeper finally stepped forward, his face a mixture of uncertainty and discomfort. "Thank you for your purchase," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier arrogance. He seemed to be struggling for the right words, as though unsure of how to fix the mess he'd created with his assumptions. Amara paused, glancing over at him. She held his gaze for a moment, watching as the reality of the situation seemed to settle over him like a heavy fog. The man looked smaller now, humbled by his own misjudgment. For a second, she considered letting him squirm in the uncomfortable silence. Let him sit with the weight of his mistake. But then she thought of her mother, how she had always taught Amara to rise above pettiness, to be better than the negativity others threw her way. So instead, Amara offered the shopkeeper a small, gracious smile. "Have a wonderful day," she said, her voice kind but firm, carrying a quiet power. The shopkeeper blinked, clearly caught off guard by her grace. "You too," he mumbled, his cheeks flushing deeper with what Amara could only guess was shame. Amara nodded politely and turned to leave. As she walked toward the door, the feeling of the boutique's marble floor beneath her sneakers felt lighter, freer. She had won. Won not just the necklace, but something bigger. She had kept her head high, maintained her dignity, and showed them all that she wasn't defined by their assumptions. When she pushed the door open and stepped back into the bustling city streets, the crisp air hit her face like a refreshing wave. The sun, still shining brightly, warmed her skin, and with the beautiful box tucked securely under her arm, she felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about buying the necklace anymore. It was about proving to herself and everyone else that she belonged, that she had the right to walk into any space with confidence and claim what was hers. As she blended into the crowd on the busy sidewalk, the sounds of the city, honking cars, chattering pedestrians, the occasional street musician, filled her ears. But inside, all she could feel was the steady beat of her own heart, full of pride and strength. Amara couldn't wait to see the look on her mother's face when she opened the gift. She knew it would be more than just surprise or joy. It would be a moment between them, a shared understanding of everything they had been through together. Her mother had always taught her to rise above, and today, Amara had done just that. The bell above the boutique door jingled softly as Amara stepped outside. The weight of the exquisitely wrapped package balanced in her hand, but her steps light and steady. The bustling city seemed to greet her warmly, as if the world outside the boutique was in sync with the victory she carried within her. The afternoon sun bathed her in a golden glow, the warmth contrasting with the cool, crisp air of the early autumn breeze. But even as the noise of the city surrounded her, Amara's mind lingered on what had just happened inside the boutique. She glanced down at the shiny gold box in her hand, the ribbon glistening under the sun, and smiled. This wasn't just a gift for her mother anymore. It had become something deeper, a symbol of standing tall, of not letting the world's smallness shrink you down. As Amara disappeared into the sea of people inside the boutique, the air remained thick with the aftermath of what had just transpired. The other customers, who'd been previously engrossed in their shopping, now exchanged awkward glances, as though they weren't quite sure what to make of the scene they had just witnessed. The assistant behind the counter was folding a scarf, her hands moving with quick, precise motions, but her eyes kept flicking toward the door, where Amara had just exited. There was a certain nervous energy about her, as if she was processing what had happened. After all, it wasn't every day that someone completely flips the script on what you've been trained to expect. Near the jewelry display, the woman in the navy suit, who had been casually browsing when Amara first entered, was still standing frozen, her fingers hovering over a pair of earrings she had been considering. Her gaze had been locked on Amara from the moment she made her purchase, and now, as the door closed behind the girl, the woman let out a small, almost imperceptible breath. She had seen the whole thing. With a frown creasing her perfectly made-up face, she turned toward the shopkeeper, who was now standing behind the main counter, his shoulders stiff with the kind of tension that made it clear he hadn't quite processed the blow to his ego. The navy-suited woman raised her eyebrows in silent judgment, her lips pursed as if she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. She knew, just like everyone else in the store, that the shopkeeper had miscalculated. The shopkeeper himself was doing his best to keep up the appearance of professionalism, but the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone told a different story. His hands moved restlessly, adjusting items on the counter that didn't need adjusting. For the first time that afternoon, he felt out of place in his own store. His mind raced, replaying the moment when Amara had looked him dead in the eyes, that calm, knowing expression on her face. He had misread her completely. From the second she had walked in, he had decided she was trouble. It was a decision based on nothing more than assumptions he had allowed to shape his actions without even realizing it. And now? Now he had been schooled. Not by loud accusations or heated words, but by the grace and quiet confidence of a teenage girl who had just proven him wrong in the most public way possible. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't called him out. She had simply shown him, with her presence, with her poise, with her purchase, that his assumptions had been unfounded. He glanced toward the assistant, who had noticed his fidgeting and was now awkwardly avoiding his gaze. She had seen the whole thing too, and he could tell by her expression that she wasn't impressed with him either. The customers who had witnessed it were now back to their browsing, but he could feel the undercurrent of their thoughts. He had judged Amara wrongly, and everyone in the room had seen it. But worst of all, he had seen it. He had seen himself, exposed in a way he wasn't used to, vulnerable to the smallness of his own bias. The assistant returned to folding scarves, though her hands were no longer quite as steady as before. She had seen Amara's calm demeanor throughout the entire ordeal, and something about it had stuck with her. There had been no anger in Amara's eyes, only disappointment, as though she had expected nothing less from the shopkeeper's behavior. And yet, the way she had handled it, with grace and quiet dignity, was something the assistant couldn't shake. Maybe Amara had learned long ago that the world often wouldn't meet her with the respect she deserved. Maybe she had expected the shopkeeper's treatment from the moment she walked in, but she hadn't let it define her. She had chosen to rise above it, and that, the assistant thought, was something worth reflecting on. As the shopkeeper stood awkwardly by the counter, lost in thought, the door to the boutique opened again. A new customer walked in, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and an expensive-looking leather jacket. He glanced around the store, clearly interested in some of the higher-end items on display, and nodded toward the shopkeeper, who quickly straightened up, trying to slip back into his role as the gatekeeper of this luxurious space. But something had changed in the shopkeeper's mind, and it was clear in the way he approached this new customer. His steps were less certain, his eyes flickering with the memory of his earlier mistake. For the first time in a long time he hesitated. He didn't want to misjudge someone again. Not like he had with Amara. "Good afternoon," he greeted the man with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me know if you need any assistance." The man nodded politely and began browsing, but the shopkeeper couldn't quite bring himself to shadow him the way he had done with Amara. The memory of her graceful departure lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder of the lesson she had unintentionally delivered, a lesson that would sit with him for much longer than he expected. Outside, Amara's footsteps echoed lightly against the sidewalk as she made her way toward the bus stop. She glanced down at the neatly wrapped package in her hands, feeling a warmth rise up in her chest. The weight of what had happened back in the boutique felt like a distant memory now. She had done what she came to do. She had bought the perfect gift for her mother, a necklace that would light up her mother's eyes the way she deserved. But more than that, she had walked out of that store with her head held high, knowing that she had made her point, even if she hadn't spoken it aloud. The bus pulled up to the curb, and Amara stepped on, finding an empty seat by the window. As the city blurred past her, she allowed herself a small smile. She thought about her mother's face when she would open the gift, how her eyes would sparkle with surprise, and how she would probably scold Amara for spending so much. But deep down, Amara knew her mother would understand. She always did. And maybe, just maybe, when the shopkeeper locked up his store later that night, he'd sit with the discomfort of his own actions. Maybe he'd think twice the next time someone who didn't fit his mold walked through his doors. Maybe the next time he'd meet them with respect rather than suspicion. But that wasn't Amara's concern anymore. She had moved on, leaving him and his small-mindedness behind her in the dust of the city streets, because Amara had won, not by being loud, not by fighting back with anger, but by showing the world who she truly was, a young woman with grace, confidence, and an unshakable sense of her own worth. And in the end, that was the most expensive thing in the store. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.